Whether you're here or not, right, in the middle of the weekend, this is a little bit maybe more difficult. Some of these classes that are, Sunday to Sunday or Wednesday to Wednesday, there's 7 days in between, so it can be easy to lose track of exactly where we're at or not remember. The schedule will keep you on track, tell you where we're at, and what to read and which lesson we're working on for that particular class. Notice on page 3, I've listed underneath how to use the workbook, I've listed a number of resources. Those are all audio resources, and they're a little bit different. So I've encouraged you in the booklet to find one of those. You can kind of dabble. I mean, you know how to do this. You kind of go, you find one of these series of lessons. You can kind of listen to a few minutes of one of them, or look through the titles, right? Get a sense of what kind of study you want to engage in. Some of these are like chapter by chapter. You could work your way through every chapter of Leviticus and listen to a Bible study or listen to a sermon on basically every section of the book. Some of these are more thematic, right? Like the one from Joe Works at the Broadmoor Church in Nashville that he did in a gospel meeting recently is like a weekend series on Leviticus. And so kind of big topics, overview of major themes in Leviticus. Find something that works for you or that you're interested in, and then use those resources. We only have 10 lessons in this particular study, and so we're limited in what we can do and how in-depth we can get. And so these are good resources for further study, for further enrichment. But when it comes to this class, notice that each class period has pre-work ahead of time, and there is maybe a video to watch or a sermon to listen to. There's reading to be done from Leviticus, and then there are a few basic kind of thought questions to prime the pump for you. So do that before coming to class. Again, with the amount of time that we have, which is not much, the more you can do outside of class, preparing for class, will just make the study all that more enriching for you. Okay, so let's remind ourselves. These are also listed on page 2 of your booklet and at the top of every class lesson. Like today for class number 2. The course goals: 1, take seriously, maybe I say take more seriously, the holiness of God. Holiness is a huge theme in Leviticus. We want to see that more seriously, and I think we'll see some instances in the book of Leviticus that may even surprise us or shock us or kind of hit us upside the head in terms of appreciating the holiness of the God that we serve. But we also want to be filled with gratitude for Jesus. We're going to talk about that today, but so many, all really, of the elements of the tabernacle worship eventually point us to Jesus, and we want to be grateful for His atoning sacrifice, without which we could not have fellowship with God. And so we want to always be looking at Jesus and giving thanks to Him, and we want to think about our own responsibility as priests of God and the consecration that God calls us to, and the ways that we can live that out on a regular basis. And we'll do all that today. But first I want to review a little bit from last week. These were your objectives. Can anyone tell me the 3 basic sections of the tabernacle? Start from the outside and work your way in. Courtyard is the outside, all people. The holy place is the priests that are in there working on the various kind of furniture elements of the tabernacle. And then the Holy of Holies, okay? One high priest once a year can enter in there. Good. What is the setting of Leviticus? Let's start with the where. Most generally, what's the where of Leviticus? It's at Mount Sinai. More specifically, the where? At the tabernacle. Yeah, verse 1 of Leviticus 1, Moses is standing outside of the tent of meeting, outside of the tabernacle, receiving these instructions from the Lord. And what's the when? Okay, after they've come out of Egypt, maybe we want to be more specific. Within the first year, it appears. Numbers 1:1 says that it was the second year when Numbers is beginning. Okay, the second year, second month. So maybe within the first month plus, or sorry, first year plus of coming to Mount Sinai, coming out of Egypt, after coming out of Egypt. And then, what's the main point? Yes, Brian.
You had the giving of the law in Exodus and the reading of the law of the people where that they would say it. What I'm getting lost here is what is
the second giving of the law doesn't happen until Deuteronomy. This is we're still with the first generation. and the first iteration, the first giving of the law, we're just seeing different elements of it. In Exodus, there were some laws about morality and conduct and behavior in the community. Really, most of what was in Exodus from a law standpoint was the instructions for the building of the tabernacle. Now that the tabernacle is constructed and his presence is there, now Leviticus is going to talk about tabernacle worship, what that looks like, as well as more instructions for holiness within the community that God is now dwelling inside of. Okay? Good question. All right, main point of Leviticus. Anybody, maybe you memorized it, or maybe you can just give your own version of it without looking at what we said last week. Main point of Leviticus? Holiness. Relationship with God, Cecilia says. Becoming like God, Michael?
How can sinful people who've committed sin live with a holy God?
Yeah. How can a people who've committed sin live with a holy God? That's the question version of basically what we suggested last week. And again, I've reserved the right to tweak this as we go, but the point of Leviticus, I think, is to instruct Israel. So Michael sets up the drama of Leviticus, okay? This is a people that are sinful. I mean, we couldn't even get out of the book of Exodus without them making a major blunder and building an idol and worshiping that idol with all kinds of fornication and sin, okay? So how can this sinful people have the holy God, the creator of the world, dwelling right there in the middle of their camp in the tabernacle? How is that possible, Michael asks? And that really is the question that sets up the point of Leviticus. And the point is to instruct Israel in what is required of them for Yahweh to dwell among them. And the two things particular that is required, one is atonement. Their sin must be dealt with. God cannot dwell with them in their sin as it is. That sin must be covered. That's the meaning of atonement. We'll talk more about that. The sin must be dealt with, and that's one requirement. The other requirement is their own holiness, that they must maintain as the holy people of God for God to dwell among them. Yes, sir. Michael, can you repeat what you said?
How can people who've committed sins live with a holy God? How can that be possible? That people who have sinned can live with God who's holy?
Because to me, how can the people live with God, but more importantly, how can God live with them?
Sure. Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's a two-edged sword, I agree,
Yeah.
but the emphasis at this point is not, I don't think, how the people can live with God. The emphasis is how God can live with the people.
Sure. No, that's fair. And, you know, one of the things I think we saw in the verses we looked at last week in the exercise in which we were discovering the point of Leviticus was the many times really through Leviticus that God talks about himself, says, I am the Lord, I will dwell among you, I will be your God, you will be my people. So God's calling the shots and God is choosing to live with them. And the question is, how is that going to happen? And these are the things that are required for that. And remember that we saw in that, and Albert did a great job of summarizing this for us, we saw that in this, even in Leviticus, is great evidence of God's love and God's grace. Because he had every right to just literally consume them with fire in their sin and say, I don't want to deal with you anymore. I don't want to live among you. But God is choosing to live among them. He is choosing to love them. He is choosing to dwell with them as his children, as his people. And so in order for that to happen, there needs to be atonement. There needs to be covering of sin, and there needs to be holiness among the people as well. Okay, Brian, last word, and then we'll move on to today.
Say that this is part of the progressive revelation, that God had fellowship and presence with Adam and Eve until sin came. And from that point forward, God is working his will to dwell among his people again. So he's tabernacled in the physical tabernacle here. Then he's tabernacled in the flesh of Christ. And now he's tabernacled or dwells within us.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, remember that we noticed that the structure of Leviticus is a chiasm is the fancy word. There's parallelism in which you have these kind of bookended sections, okay? Rituals in chapter 1 to 7, bookended by rituals of the festivals in 23 to 25. Instructions for priests in 8 to 10, bookended with instructions to priests in 21 and 22. Laws of ritual purity in 11 to 15, bookended with laws of moral purity in 18 to 20. And the Day of Atonement, and that kind of highest of holiest days on the Israelite calendar, and the instructions for that are right in the middle of the book for this very reason, because this book is all about how can God dwell with these people. And the Day of Atonement addresses that in a powerful way. But for today, we start at the beginning in the first 7 chapters and the instructions for the sacrifices and offerings that God gave them. So by the end of our time, the next 32 minutes, you will be able to, I hope, list and tell me what are the 6 types of offerings described in this section of Leviticus. Hopefully you will be able to identify elements of the offerings that point us to Jesus, and then make some kind of connection between the offerings that were given by the people of Israel here in Leviticus and the offerings, the responsibilities that we have before God as his priests. Okay, so in your Bible, be looking at chapters 1 to 7 of Leviticus. And over the course of these 7 chapters, you really see 5 main offerings described, and then there's a 6th one that gets added in as well, okay? But the way this works is that over the course of Leviticus 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then a little bit of into 6. So everything up to 6 and verse 7, you see each of these offerings explained in some detail. We'll talk about what those are and the significance of them. But then in chapter 6 and verse 8, notice it says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law of the burnt offering." And so Leviticus 6, 8 through the end of chapter 7 goes back through all the same sacrifices that were described in 1 to 6, but with specific instructions for the priests and how they are to administer and in many cases how they are to consume, eat parts of these sacrifices, okay? So with each of these offerings I'll put up here, you'll see kind of the main text in which they are described, as well as in parentheses the portion of instructions given to the priests regarding that same offering. And then just to give it away from the start, but maybe to help us to kind of understand what we're looking at here, look at Leviticus 7 and verse 37 and 38. This is the final word of this section here. Leviticus 7 and verse 37 and 38. In summary of all of this, the text says, "This is the law of the burnt offering, of the grain offering, of the sin offering, of the guilt offering, of the ordination offering, and of the peace offering, which the Lord commanded Moses on Mount Sinai on the day which he commanded the people of Israel to bring their offerings to the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai." It's a nice little section to circle or put a star by. If you get confused, you go to this verse and it tells you these are the 6 types of offerings, and then you can maybe go back through and match up in those 7 chapters where God is talking about or giving instructions for each of those 6 offerings, okay? But we'll go in order and maybe point out some things. I put this in your booklet. I was trying to be helpful and give you like the lengths of the lines to match up, but I got them mixed up. So that's actually, if you try to do that, you'd be wrong. There are 3 offerings that essentially the worshiper is saying to God, "I'm sorry." And they have to do with sin and guilt and atonement for that sin or restitution of that guilt. And then there are 2 offerings that are simply a way of the worshiper is saying thank you and offering up just a pleasing sacrifice to God out of worship and thanksgiving to him. Okay, so we'll go through these in the order that they are in the text. Chapter 1 tells us about the burnt offering. Okay, and you'll notice in verse 4 of chapter 1 the language of being accepted. Okay, so this is the idea of coming to God for him to accept you, even in your sin, because in that same verse it says, "It shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him." Again, a lot we want to say about the idea of atonement. Basically, it's a covering over of sin. And if you watch the Bible Project video in preparation for today's class, you maybe understand that concept from the way that they described it. But the burnt offering is an offering to be accepted before God, to make atonement. There were burnt offerings always being given. In Exodus, it describes that in front of the tabernacle, every morning, every evening, there would be a burnt offering. So there's kind of this continual offering of acceptance before God so that he could make atonement for their sin. But if you look at verse 9, verse 13, verse 17, you also see this repeated language of a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. That language is repeated throughout many of the sacrifices, but you see this idea of offering something to God that it would be pleasing to him. We've already mentioned that. I think Michael referred to that in a prayer this morning, and we've seen maybe a song or two with that kind of language of offering this sacrifice, a soothing aroma before God. The burnt offering, and we'll come back to this by the end, the burnt offering was to be burnt. That's surprising, but everything was consumed by fire. Nothing left over, nothing eaten by any of the priests, completely burnt up, and then we'll see later on there's actually instructions to take what remained, the kind of trash that remained outside the camp, get it as far away from the people as possible, and don't touch any of it. Okay, so in some ways this is kind of the most sacred of the offerings, and cannot be touched and cannot be consumed. Right? That's the burnt offering. Then in chapter 2 we go to one that's called a grain offering. Chapter 2 verse 1. Interestingly, this is a different word. The word here for grain offering is actually more about a tribute than it is about a sacrifice. So you're bringing something. It could be bread, it could be flour, it could be first fruits of what you grew in your field, but you are bringing this to the Lord as a grain offering. It is, again, chapter 2, verse 16, a food offering to Yahweh. You're giving him something, saying thank you to him for what he has blessed you with. But notice in chapter 2 and verse 3 and verse 10, it says that the rest, so you offer some of it, and then the rest, it says, shall be for Aaron and his son. So here for the first time we see what we'll see repeated, which is that the priests themselves could eat of these offerings, or at least a portion of these offerings that were brought to the Lord. Yes, Harrison?
Is that burnt offering meaning destroyed by fire?
Yes.
Offering is
totally consumed. Yeah, totally consumed by fire. That's right. Okay. Burnt offering, grain offering. We have the other Thanksgiving offering in chapter 3. It's called a peace offering. And notice again, chapter 3, verse 5, verse 16, it is a food offering with a pleasing aroma. And then later on in chapter 7, the verses that I gave you here, from verse 11 down to verse 36, there's actually quite a bit said in chapter 7 about this peace offering. But there are quite a few details given in chapter 7, verse 11 to 36 about what the priest can eat, right? They can eat certain portions, right? If an animal from the herd is given, they can eat the breast and the right thigh. So there's a portion of these offerings that the priest can eat, and that is detailed what can be eaten, what can not be eaten. But some of it, again, offered to God, and some of it eaten by the priests. So we have a grain offering and a peace offering that are simply ways of saying thank you to God. You have a sin offering. Back on the other side, in chapter 4 and verse 1, and you'll notice that, for instance, in verse 1, and actually over and over again in this section, it uses the language of unintentional sin. Chapter 4 and verse 2, I should say, not verse 1. If anyone sins unintentionally in any of the Lord's commandments about things not to be done, and does any one of them, it is to be, if it is the anointed priest who sins, thus bringing guilt on the people, he shall offer for the sin that he has committed a bull from the herd without blemish to the Lord for a sin offering. And you see that over and over again in this section, that even sin that is unintentional, I think meaning that you do something and you weren't aware of the way that it maybe impacted another person, or you weren't aware of your own uncleanness and then going before the Lord in an unclean state, whatever it is, even unintentional, there is this blemish then on the individual, a blemish even on the community, especially if it is a priest, as we read in chapter 4, verse 2 and 3, okay? And that has to be dealt with. And so over and over again, chapter 4, verse 26, and verse 31, and verse 35, chapter 5 and verse 7, verse 10 and verse 13, you see the language over and over again of making atonement for the sin, and the sin will be forgiven when this atonement has been made. And if you go look at chapter 6 and verse 26, this is also an offering that can be eaten by the priests after they have offered it to the Lord. And then finally, the guilt offering. And kind of funny, in chapter 7, I laughed when I read this. You don't laugh much when you read Leviticus, but all these things are confusing to us, especially it's outside of our context. We're not familiar with it at all, and so it's difficult and technical and all that. And so I came down to chapter 7 and verse 7, because the big question is, what's the difference between all of these, right? Chapter 7, verse 7, the text of the Bible, this is the Holy Spirit speaking here. The guilt offering is just like the sin offering. There is one law for them, okay? Now, I think in particular in that context it's talking about what can be eaten and all of that. So he's saying it works the same way in terms of what you offer and what you eat. But it was funny to me because I figured someone would ask, what's the difference between the sin offering and the guilt offering? And I would say, well, the Bible says one's just like the other, okay? I will say, though, that if you look, for instance, in chapter 5, verse 15, chapter 5, verse 18, and again in chapter 6 and verse 6, in discussion of the guilt offering, there is this language of compensation or restitution or paying an equivalent price in the offering for the wrong done. And so it seems like the guilt offering, and also in chapter 6, notice in verse 1 of chapter 6, if anyone sins and commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit or security through robbery, if he has oppressed his neighbor, found something lost and lied about, swearing falsely, yada, 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 right? It seems like, sorry, Granny, was that irreverent? It seems like with the guilt offering, the idea of harming your neighbor and having to pay for it is maybe more in view with this particular offering. And so not only are you making you're asking before God to receive atonement, forgiveness for your sin, but with the guilt offering, it seems like there's another layer of the restitution that you're acknowledging is owed to the party who was harmed, right? So if there is a distinction, maybe that is at least part of it, okay? But those are the basic offerings and kind of basic information about each of them. And then when you come to chapter 6 and verse 19 to 23, there is one more offering described, and it was called the ordination offering in that summary passage in chapter 7, verse 37. But in chapter 6, verse 19, it says, this is the offering that Aaron and his sons should offer to the Lord on the day when he is anointed. And so this is for when the priests are anointed, when they are ordained to serve as priests, and there's a specific offering for that specific occasion. All right. So let me ask you this. That's a lot. And even from just talking through those, and especially if you had opportunity to read, even just one time, read through this section before coming to class, this is the question that I want to ask you, okay? That's somewhat about the distinctions between these offerings. I'll ask you, what do you see repeated? What do these different offerings have in common? They each have their own particular purpose. They each have their own different way of carrying it out. They each have their own different way that they can be eaten or not. But what do they have in common? What do you notice as you read through all these sacrifices? What are the similarities through all of them? And then, what can we learn from that? Yes, Harrison. Okay, sure. Harrison says they make your life right with God. That's what they have in common. Brian? Thank you, Harrison.
Offering to the Lord, it involves sacrifice on behalf of the offerer, giving to the Lord, of which we now become living sacrifices.
Okay. All of it requires a sacrifice, Brian says, of the offerer, and it's all given to the Lord. Okay. Thank you, Brian. What else would you say about similarities between all of these sacrifices? Okay, Kathy says it's to be the best. If it's an animal offering, she says it's to be without blemish. The grain offering was to be of fine flour. And there's another actually detail of the grain offering, the bread offering that is mentioned. No leaven, right? And so with the animals, you have this idea of without blemish. With the bread and the grain, you have this idea of fine flour and bread without leaven. Okay, so you see that kind of in here.
I don't know in there, but it's
Yeah, and this is just one section. There are other sections in the Torah that describe offerings, but in here, the offerings of grain, is, from what I remember, someone can correct me, are to be unleavened. Yes, Sharon, and then Mike. Okay, burn, fire, involved in all of them. Okay, thank you, Sharon. Pure
That
state.
gets back to what Kathy was talking about the no blemish, flour with no leaven. They were to be in a pure state.
Okay. Pure state. I should have been writing this stuff down. I'm failing in my responsibility. Offered to God, making oneself right before God, Harrison said. Brian talked about the sacrifice. You have to give up something, right? And it's all offered to God. We have this idea of the quality of it, okay, and it being free of blemish or free of impurity. We have this idea of consumption and fire involved in all of them. Albert, and then Angie.
You have to self-reflect upon your daily life and realize or you have to be instructed by another brother or sister that, hey, you've caused this wrong against me. So all of these require that you be self-reflective, you constantly be aware of your situation, and you take action. And it's not a specific, every Thursday we're going to open up the temple and y'all bring your sacrifices.
Yeah, thank you, Albert. And that's interesting, and that's true. We will find other places where there will be dates and times that are appointed. They're called appointed times because they are times that are appointed. They're appointments to keep with the Lord, so to speak. But to Albert's point, in this section, yeah, all of these are of the volition of the worshiper who has to identify the need and then choose to make that offering as needed. Angie?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. You know, a decision has to be made that an offering is needed. And then the preparation to make the offering. I mean, you may not have that readily available, so you have to make the decision, yes, we're going to do this offering, and then get prepared and, you know, physically and mindset and all that to actually make the offering. You know, not just doing it, you know, I'm just going to do this. You have to mentally prepare to make this offering.
Thank you, Angie. And Angie, or anybody, but I'll how to ask this without forcing you to read my mind or giving it away. The preparation, why is that kind of focused preparation necessary for all of these offerings, no matter which one? Are they easy to carry out? So there's the heart, the state of mind, which we'll see even in here in the Torah, is God is requiring. They're not necessarily easy, although. Does God make any provision for making it easier, so to speak? Did you catch that if you read through this?
The birds.
Yeah.
Affordable.
Where is it? Is it with the sin offering, I believe? The sin offering will go through and talk about, or maybe it's even as early on as the burnt offering, right? Chapter 1, you have 3 different tiers almost, right, of the kind of animal that can be offered. And you'll see throughout here that it will mention if someone doesn't have an animal, right, you're not wealthy enough to have a herd, and even if it's just 2 turtle doves, right, 2 pigeons or whatever it is, which, by the way, that's what Mary and Joseph had to offer, right, gives you some sense of where they were at on the social scale, okay? But there is provision made. So you see God kind of, tailoring the instructions based on, the standing of the worshiper. Even still, to Angie's point, there are these details in every case, details that you have to pay attention to them and you have to respect them. And that takes preparation, that takes care in each of these instances. Okay? Last word on this, Brian, and then we'll move on here.
One thing I find interesting, that of these sacrifices, other than perhaps the ordination of the priest, there's no instructions about the shedding of blood and the sprinkling of blood. We do know it on the Day of Atonement, but I'm not seeing the blood coming into focus in these 7 chapters.
There are places, I think it's scattered, you might say, throughout here, like the blood. But I'm just, 4:25 here, this is talking about the sin offering. The priest shall take some of the blood of the sin offering with his finger, put it on the horns of the altar, pour out the rest of the blood at the base of the altar. So the significance of that is not explained, and we'll get some of that later in Leviticus, but you do see the emphasis on blood even in this section here. All right, so let me ask you this, and I'll just I'm not going to give up on the group assignment, even just for time. I'll stick to my guns here. Take 2 or 3 minutes, turn to your neighbors, and discuss this. Where do we see Jesus in all of this? Okay, and you can pick from the obvious ones, low-hanging fruit, or you can think about more maybe complex and subtle ways in which Jesus is seen in these chapters. But talk with your neighbors real quick, and we'll share out in a minute. Where do we see Jesus in the instructions of the offerings in Leviticus 1-7? All right, what do you got? Where do we see Jesus in Leviticus 1-7? The perfect sacrifice, Granny, thank you. Yes, Mike.
Is supposed to go before God, and therefore his sin offering cleansed us of those impurities.
Nothing impure. So his perfect sacrifice, Granny said, cleanses us of those impurities. That's precisely the point that Peter makes in 1 Peter 1 and verse 19 when he says Christ is the lamb without blemish. And now we understand Leviticus 1-7 why that's so critical for Jesus to have been without blemish in the most perfect sense of that phrase. Rich?
Preparation. He prepared to be that sacrifice by living that perfect life.
Yeah.
An example for us.
Yeah. He quotes at one point from Psalm 40, I believe it is, sacrifices and offerings, Jesus says, you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. And it says, behold, it is written of me in the book of the law, I have come to do your will. And so Jesus fulfills the sacrifice and offerings, which were shadows, by coming and doing the will of God, preparing himself to ultimately be the sacrifice that was required for our sin. Thank you, Rich. John?
I was just thinking how both were very public and very known instances. You couldn't go into the tabernacle. Jesus was up on the cross in front of sinners and saints alike. It was very visible what was happening.
Okay, thank you, John. Public, visible. Brian?
What I see here is the death, blood, and atonement for sin. And of course, we understand with death, blood, and atonement for sin, of which is part of the sacrifice, and we understand that to point to Christ, because once he suffered that perfect sacrifice, there are no more sacrifices except being a living sacrifice.
Thank you, Brian. We'll come back to the unleavened thing later on in the class when we get to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But Brian mentioned the word atonement. In Romans 3, verse 25, Paul says that Jesus is the propitiation for our sin. That's the New Testament word for the Old Testament word atonement. Okay, those two words mean the same thing. And again, the idea is of covering over. Okay, and so Paul says that Jesus is the atonement. So all these times you read in the book of Leviticus about the sacrifice, which is the atonement for the people of God so that God can live in their midst, Jesus is that propitiation. He is that atonement, okay? And we've recently done Hebrews, and really in the Leviticus class, you could spend half the time in Hebrews. We won't do that, but remember that in a place like Hebrews 9:22, he points out, to Brian's point earlier, that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins, but Christ being the perfect sacrifice, the substance that all these shadows were pointing to, then there is no longer a need for a sacrifice because Jesus is the perfect sacrifice. Yes, Harrison? It's related, but really the idea is of covering. In fact, the same Hebrew word is used in the story of Noah and the ark, of covering the ark with pitch, interestingly. So the idea is that you're covering over sin. But, that's kind of a different metaphor. What you're suggesting is the same concept in it with another metaphor of paying the price for something, which is a metaphor that's also used other places in Scripture. So. Look at Hebrews 13 with me, and then we'll maybe get to knock out a couple things here before the end of class. We have 5 minutes here. Hebrews 13. We're basically done in Leviticus 1 to 7, so don't worry about finding your way back there. Hebrews 13, according to the objectives, we wanted to be able to list the 6 offerings. We also wanted to identify how this points to Jesus. And then finally, we wanted to see what this means for us and our responsibility. So we'll be able to touch on those last 2 objectives here in Hebrews 13. Notice in verse 10, I'll quiz you here, okay? Verse 10, it says, "We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat." What was the one offering that the priest could not eat of? The burnt offering, okay? And what was done with the remains of the burnt offering? Taken outside the camp. Thank you, Denise. Okay, so notice what the Hebrew writer is doing here and what he's talking about. Verse 10, "We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp." Verse 12, "So Jesus also suffered outside the camp, outside the gates, in order to sanctify the people through his own blood." Okay? So Jesus is that perfect burnt offering where he is sacrificed and disposed of outside the gate of the city of Jerusalem. Okay? Which matches up with the symbolism from Leviticus and the burnt offering. Okay? But then, so we have this fulfilled in Christ. But then notice what the Hebrew writer says about that for us in verse 13. "Therefore let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach that he endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come." The point here is one about acceptance and belonging. And the Hebrew writer is saying, stop trying to hang out in the city so that you can belong in this world, in this city. Okay? Christ, the perfect sacrifice, took on reproach, took on shame, took on ostracization, if that's a word. Ostracization, you know what I'm trying to say. He was rejected. He was kicked out even of his own people. And so the Hebrew writer is saying, he's our sacrifice, and so we need to go to him and accept the fact that we don't belong here. We don't belong inside the city. We don't belong inside the camp now because we're looking for a lasting city, a city which is to come, right? There's a powerful point made about that here in Hebrews 13. But one more verse in Hebrews 13. We left off in verse 14. We have no lasting city. We seek the city that is to come. Verse 15, "Through him then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God." You see the language of Leviticus still here. We are offering up a sacrifice of praise to God, which is what? The fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Okay? I don't actually know if he's referring to singing, if he's referring to the way that we speak about God, whatever of those it is, maybe all of the above. The Hebrew writer says we are offering a sacrifice to God, and it is the fruit of our lips. It is the things that we say. It is the songs that we sing. And so all of that we said about the care and about the preparation for and the significance, the importance, the gravity of those sacrifices in Leviticus 1 to 7, I think can be carried forward to the offerings that we make. In this specific instance, the sacrifice of praise, the fruit of our lips that we offer to God. Mike, you want to jump in here? Yeah.
I thought maybe going back to it, is that when you talk about the leaven, and we're told that Christ went outside the gate, we're to be outside the gate, don't be part of this, because a little leaven
That's right.
leavens the whole loaf.
Yeah.
So that's the reason we have to separate ourselves from that.
That's right. And that's Paul's point here in 1 Corinthians 5, and saying that we eat the feast without leaven. We need to remove the leaven from amongst ourselves, meaning that bad influence. So, no, thank you, Mike. Other passages, Brian mentioned this passage earlier. Romans 12 says that the sacrifice is me. I give my body as a living sacrifice. Okay? So again, all the significance of Leviticus 1-7. Yes, Jesus is the perfect sacrifice, but the point is, Romans 12, verse 1 and 2, I get on the altar with him, is one way to think about that, right? And I offer my whole self, my whole body, as a burnt offering, as a sacrifice to God. 1 Peter 2 and verse 5 says that as priests we offer spiritual sacrifices, although it doesn't explain exactly what that is. Philippians 4 talks about the gift, the money. Think about this. Dirty money, right? Filthy lucre. The money that was given by the Philippians to Paul to support his work in the kingdom, Paul says that's a sacrifice with a sweet-smelling aroma to God. When we are generous with what we have to give to those who are in need or to help others advance the gospel, then we're doing what we saw in Leviticus 1-7, the offerings, the sacrifice, to Brian's point that was made. You're giving up something with forethought, with preparation, with volition, to Angie and Albert's points, to not only help other people, but ultimately as a sacrifice to God. Okay. Hopefully you can do these things. We'll stop there and quiz you on them next Sunday. But before then, there's a sermon in your booklet from Kleinwood's website I encourage you to listen to. And then there's 2 sections of Leviticus, 8-10, 21-22 to listen to, to read. You can listen to it as well. And then some booklet questions to answer before you come to class. All right. Thanks, guys. Sorry I kept you a little over.